Where are you from originally, and tell me a little bit about your growing up?
Well, I was born in Irvington, New Jersey, which is not quite a suburb, but it abuts Newark, New Jersey. And in fact, I was born literally a half a block from Newark, so I tell people it was Newark, just because they know it better. But I grew up, I guess the first 12 years in tenements in that part of the country. We lived in a tenement. My father was a steel worker, my mother a housewife. And then because of the threat of gangs and so on, we moved literally across town, again, close to the Newark line, but a different part of Newark. And that's, where we lived until my parents retired and I got married and so on.
How did you become interested in history?
Oh, several different ways. I credit my father with a lot of it. One, where he worked, he and his buddies were always talking about some stuff and things and so on. And one day my father came home and we were talking, and I guess I must have been second, third grade, maybe third grade. He said, "You ever think of stamp collecting?" And so he laid out stamp collecting to me in a heavy German accent. And, I guess we agreed to try it. And so my first interest in history, and for that matter, geography, came from getting all these stamps from all over the world. And since I'm first generation American and lots of relatives in Germany, we always got stamps on stuff from Germany and stuff like that. And then after that, the logical part of the answer is teachers. I had a number of good history teachers, one who was absolutely amazing. He was my freshman history teacher in high school. He was a world history teacher. And his name was, Robert E. Lee. And he got his bachelor's at the Citadel and eventually his master's and his PhD at Rutgers. And what I learned from him was not only history, but that absolutes in history just don't exist. And that it's all interpretation, certainly based on research and so on and so forth. And he and I would debate the most minutest point. I one time got a 68 on a test from him, which was absurd. And I went in and talked to him about it. By the time I came out, I had a 98. And he said, "The only reason you didn't get the 2 points is because I didn't want you to have them." But anyway, Robert E. Lee, he was an amazing guy. And our high school was a working class high school. And prior to my attendance there, our most famous graduate was Jerry Lewis, the comedian. And since then, it's been Queen Latifah and a couple of other magnificent singers, and it also shows the demographic that shifted. But I credit that high school with a lot because I also had one other great teacher there, a chemistry teacher. And as a result, I actually have undergraduate degrees in history and chemistry. So it's...
So where did you go to school?
Rutgers.
Okay.
I started out did my undergraduate work at Rutgers, and then the history department convinced me to stay on for a master's degree. But after that, I met my wife at Rutgers, and but after that, given the greater New York area, Rutgers was a powerful school for revolutionary history, colonial history, and so on, and I didn't want to do that. I had, along the way, fallen in love with Russian history, and so that meant I had to go into the city. And so I got accepted at Columbia, NYU, and so on and so forth, and for a lot of reasons picked NYU and finished up there.
Did you focus on cartography also while you were at university?
No, I did both at Rutgers, less so at NYU because of the Russian studies. But at Rutgers, I focused a little bit more on geography, but not the cartographic aspects of it.
When did you come to UTA?
1973.
All right. And what position were you in? when you arrived?
I was brought in, and probably one of the last in the liberal arts, as a tenured associate professor. It was, the mechanics of it was that salary-wise, it was a lateral move. And I said, okay. I said, but I'm not giving up the rank, because I was tenured at James Madison, where I was.
I see.
And I said, I'm not giving up the rank. And my department chairman said, well, and he went to battle with the powers that be, and, won the day on it.
What were your main research areas and courses at UT?
Well, I was brought in to teach Russian East European history. And today that's trendily known as Eurasian history. It always was, but now they've changed the name of it. And then I was also brought in to teach theory and methods with a heavy emphasis on theory. And that's essentially what I did for quite a few years. Every semester I taught Russian history, 8 o'clock in the morning, the first run. Nobody wanted the hour. I loved it. And then eventually I taught graduate courses related to that Baltic history, Russian Revolution, and so on and so forth. And then also I taught the theory and methods on all three levels, that is, all the way up through the PhD eventually. Again, with a greater emphasis on theory, because I consider myself, to a large extent, an intellectual historian. And that I think originally what the department wanted. In other words, they wanted less, this is how you write a paper, and more, think about history, and what history is and is not.
We'll talk about your transition into cartography.
Well, I was here, I guess, about 2 years, and two of our Western frontier historians, who became very good friends of mine, Bob Williamson, who taught primarily Texas history, and then Elliot West, who is today one of the premier Western historians. And Elliot and I are still like brothers to this day. We were the kids on the faculty. I was the youngest person on all the faculties I'd worked on before I came to Texas. Well, Elliot is 3 months younger than I am, so he was the kid, and I was not when I got here, But they were talking about this donation that this man, Jenkins Garrett, had made here on Texana and Mexican War. And to be honest with you, I knew very little about Texas, not much more about the Mexican War, or Mexican-American War. And just to hear them talk about it and the things they were finding out and so on. For example, Bob Williamson found the original words, period words, from the Republic of the Yellow Rose of Texas, which today is politically more than incorrect, and so on. And Bob was just amazed with it. And so these guys were bantering this stuff around. They were talking about it to other American historians and so on. And eventually I came up here, I think, with Elliot or Bob, and looked at the stuff and so on. And I said, okay, and that was that. And then a couple of years after that, Virginia donated her maps. And I started looking at them, and historians are always interested in maps. They will use them, et cetera, et cetera. And I started looking at them and so on, and spent more and more time just coming up. And at that time, the director of special collections was Robert Martin. And Bob and I, he was sort of an early mentor on how to look at maps and stuff like that. And then, sort of peripheral to that, my wife and I did my first presentation at the American Historical Association. And for a guy as young as I was, that was amazing, and it was in New Orleans. And we were walking down Royal Street, and this bookstore was going out of business, and they were selling maps. And there was this beautiful, wonderful little map of the Caspian Sea. And being a Russian historian, I said, I got to have that. And so my wife dickered with the guy, and I think we paid $35 for it, which for us was a lot of money, but we did. And it turns out that, well, let me go then a little bit further. There is a book on Texas cartography, a very small book, and in it there's a remark about one Herman Mall, and there's a paragraph, and it says, in effect, that Mall contributed absolutely nothing to the history of Texas cartography. So I said to myself, in a book that small, why would you waste a paragraph? And then I thought a minute. I said, wait a minute, the Caspian Sea map you so love is by Herman Mall. And so I went home, and sure enough, et cetera. And so then I came back here, and I said to Bob, I said, you have any Mall? Did Virginia give us any Mall maps? He said, oh, yeah, quite a few. I said, could I see one or two? So we put them all out, literally, laid them all out on the tables, every flat surface in here. And I said, amazing, absolutely amazing stuff. And that hooked me on Herman Mall, which my friend John Doctor in Washington calls Mall Mania. And then I got to meet Virginia, and I mentioned about the Mall stuff. She said, well, she said, I've always liked him too. And then she and I had fairly extensive conversations over the years on Mall. And when I'd find out something, I'd tell her about it. And, and she would then react and so on and so forth. And we became very, very close friends. Jenkins involved too, and my wife Judy. And so I credit Virginia's donation more than anything else for really bringing me into the field that I'm supposed to be now somewhat known in,
Yes. Well, along those lines, talk about the impact of that first donation by Jenkins Garrett. Talk about the impact on UTA special collections.
Well, first of all, it was, I think, I first noticed it in the department because we had two or three, probably three individuals who could relate directly to it, and they did almost immediately. Then when it came here, it was the basis for special collections. In other words, there was George Green, one of my colleagues, was beginning to put together this history of Texas labor archive, and there was a Texas politics archive in the making. But the Garrett donation sort of was the beginning. And the first person who headed up special collections here knew nothing about the collections, but knew about setting it up and administering it somewhat. That's as far as I'll go. But thereafter, people like Bob Martin and J.C. Martin, and both of them, of course, wrote a definitive study of Texas cartography, really began to beat the drum for this collection. And for not only Jenkins's collection, but eventually for Virginia's as well. And by the time at the end of Bob Martin's tenure as the head of special collections here, Virginia's collection was recognized as one of the 10 most important university collections in North America. And that was literally, within the first decade of the donation. Wow. And, Jenkins and Virginia both consistently wanted these areas to grow, and they made available monies, the Garrett Endowment, of which I guess I'm the last surviving member of the board of the endowment. And they always hoped that it would not only sort of be a bedrock here, but that it would increase, having others donate and so on and so forth, and that it would have an influence, that their donation would have an influence across various professions, academic professions.
What kind of influence do you think it had on teaching and research here inside UTA?
Well, again, I hate blowing my own horn, but I have to in this regard. One of the first things we did once I got involved in it on the academic side was create courses on the history of cartography, the history of discovery and exploration that related directly to this area, and both graduate and undergraduate. And that eventually led to the creation of the geography program, which now it is the Department of History and Geography, which is what it should be, And there we began looking around, for how you do this. And the Garretts were very much behind it and involved in it. And we had what we called at that point an academic vice president, Bill Baker, who was important in it. He supported everything I tried to do. We didn't know what to do, so I approached the National Geographic Society, and they sent individuals here to look at what we had and talk about what we could do, and then they gave us money to do it. They gave us some money to do it, which might be the first grants that ever came into this collections area. And so the geography program is as a result of what happened here. Again, in the various history courses, I think my colleagues became more visual, more cartographic, and geology. I should backtrack a little. Without the geology department, we wouldn't have had a geography program because they collaborated in it as well. And so, it began to sort of reach out and bring a lot of people together who normally wouldn't have talked to each other in any academic way,
So later on, there was a gift of atlases.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, collectors don't know when to stop, and Virginia started out by wanting every printed map of Texas. Then she wanted every printed map that showed Texas or any part of it on it. So that means we went from a regional area to a continental area and eventually to a global area. And that's important because she never saw this as a localized collection. She always saw it as something that would expand and grow and so on. Well, one of the things the Garretts collected were atlases. And again, part of that is as a result of Virginia's eventually seeing world maps with bits of Texas on it, or what would become Texas on it, as important. And then, I don't know who got the idea, but they decided they wanted every map that National Geographic ever printed, in there that you used to get with the magazines. And they went after those and got them. And so then, as Jenkins once told me, so here we are. He said, now this house where they lived in Fort Worth, he said, it is not small. But he said, it was not big enough to hold what we were doing, because their sort of collections area was on the second floor of this house. And so they, sort of piggybacked it eventually onto the original Virginia's donation, and it then became part of the Cartographic History Library.
What was their background originally? Let's
start with Jenkins. Jenkins's father was an ordained Baptist minister, and his pulpit was the Northside Baptist Church in Fort Worth, and this is where Jenkins grew up, went to school, and so on. And Jenkins met Virginia because she went to the Northside Baptist Church with her family. Now, eventually, Jenkins went on to Harvard and Harvard Law, and Virginia worked as a sort of secretary in Fort Worth. She worked on what really were the first proto computers, and in this office that she worked. And eventually they then got married, and Jenkins went after law school into the FBI, and they were on their honeymoon in San Francisco on December the 7th, 1941. And Jenkins's first assignment was dealing with the Nisi, the Japanese Americans who were considered to be of suspect. That was the words he always used, of suspect, because he didn't like what he had to do, and so eventually, when the stint with the FBI was over, they came back to Fort Worth, had 3 kids. He became an attorney here in Fort Worth, and then eventually his practice moved toward one family and their business. And he then to quote him as best I can, when they invested stuff, they had to, get him involved. He made little investments with them and followed some of their leads and so on, and thereby began to accrue, some capital of his own. And that's that.
And so then what led them to begin collecting maps? How did that interest come up?
Jenkins was always interested in Texas history, and I'm not quite sure. Well, I know he was very much interested in the Republic, and thereby also that leads to the Mexican War. But his basic area of interest was from the Republic, or perhaps the Mexican Revolution and the Republic, through the Civil War. And thereafter, he was interested in the frontier and so on, but primarily Texas-wise, that was the area that he was very much interested in.
I see.
And that came, I think, from his own background in Texas. And he studied undergraduate at University of Texas at Austin, and he studied under Walter Prescott Webb, who I never met, but, is an amazing historian. So I think all of that is part of, what brought him to it. And as Virginia used to say, when he went around to talk about such things and to buy stuff and that she eventually just had to have her own area to do something in, and she had always liked maps and started when she was like 7 years old navigating for her father, with road maps, as a lot of us did when we were kids, and it went on from there. So it was what Jenkins called competitive collecting, and he also at one point said the good news is you don't get a spouse asking, why do you want to buy that? Because then you can say to her, why do you want to buy that?
Right.
So they never had that kind of conflict.
That's great.
Allegedly. They were sort of mentors to Judy and me in this whole DFW area, the university, and so on and so forth. They also, especially Virginia, was responsible for us deciding to retire in Santa Fe rather than South Padre Island. And again, I've said this story many times, but famous evening we spent with Virginia and Jenkins, and she said, now, Dennis, she said, I'd hate to lose you two to Texas. She said, but why would you want to retire down in South Padre Island? And I said, well, I'm from New Jersey. Jersey kids are imprinted by the shore. I love surf fishing. And I said, I love getting into the water this deep, casting out, et cetera, et cetera. And I love beachcombing. She said, you'll be bored in 3 weeks. I said, no. I said, every day something different comes up on the beach. And in fact, on South Padres Beach, I found a $1 real Spanish coin that had washed up at one point, and all kinds of other neat stuff, shells and stuff like that. And she said, okay. She said, where's the library for you? I said, Brownsville. And she said, no, for you. I said, well, probably Austin or San Antonio. And she said, how far away is that? I said, 5 hours by car. She said, And her words, not mine, she said, do you have a plan B? And I said, well, we've been looking at New Mexico more and more and more and more, She said, not bad. I said, but we're looking at Santa Fe. And I said, Santa Fe is smaller than here, and she said, and the library, nearest library is, I said, in Albuquerque, UNM. And she said, and I said, they're not going to pay any attention to me down there, She said, where did your wife get her PhD from? I said, UNM. She said, And that's how it started.
I see.
So that's the kind of friendship we had.
Yes, that's wonderful. So in 1997,
by the way, you might ask Gerald if you interview him about this trip we took to a collector's house up north, here north of Dallas.
Okay.
And how he and Jenkins ragged on me because I was driving and got lost.
I'll ask.
And I was permanently scarred by that.
Oh, I'll be sure to put that in.
This happens often. Two of my geography professors, when we were on field trips, they had both the reputation to get lost out there, even with maps in their hand. So this is a common thing.
Yeah, but we went up to this collector, and he's a good friend, and he has the manuscript map of the Humboldt map that I've shown and written up. The Humboldt manuscript map, and one of the things we went up there was to see and was try to convince him to put it here. But coming back, I got horribly lost. And I admit it, but those two did not help me.
That's good. So what did the 1997 maps and textbooks that were added to the collection, how did they change the collection?
Well, I mean, obviously they filled in some spaces. They were also not the major ones, because the major ones were here already, or at least the ones that were affordable. I mean, there's still a couple that we would like to have. And by the way, be nice to Wes, who's here, because he's got one of them we want. And we've been working on him a long time to get this one. But in any case, so they filled in some spaces. They also broadened some of it, and Imre knows them. Aren't you going to talk about one tomorrow, one of those maps?
Yes, about the Sebastian Münster, 1550, Neugriechenland.
Yeah, see, and stuff that fit, but wasn't there, So in other words, it again broadened it. And again, the Garrett's idea always was that the original gift would attract others. And I can speak better about cartography because I'm not a Texas historian. But it's certainly done that. I mean, you've got Don McGurk tonight, you've got Wes talking tonight, you got me talking. All of us have given and continue to give stuff here to the collection. And there are a lot of others. David Finfrock will be here, and Frankie, who was one of my former students, et cetera, et cetera. So
which Garrett items did you use most in your courses, and why?
Well, Imre may do it a little differently now, but I used to do essentially a chronological approach to mapping, which stopped, roughly around the First World War. And to be honest with you, 20th century mapping bores me. It doesn't. My colleague over there, Imre really does some nice work in 20th century mapping. It bores me. 21st century mapping is really boring. So I'm a historian. So I say, that's fine.
Just to put his mind at ease, I'm mostly in the 18th and the 19th century,
okay.
And I tell my students map history for me and for the purpose of our classes stops when the computer stuff comes in.
Amen.
So by the 1970s, and this amen, you please let in.
Yeah, please.
Amen.
Mea culpa. I ask forgiveness. Sveti Imre, I ask.
Okay.
But no, so I would approach it, I do the ancient world in a whole session, which we didn't have anything really of. But as we got into the depth of the collection, then you can do all kinds of things. And like Imre says, 17th, 18th century, early 19th century, imperialism and so on and so forth. And then also I would do some methodology, that is printing methods, the engraving, et cetera, and we have examples of all kinds we have lithographs and so on and so forth. And I'd also go over to the art department, had a colleague over there, a printmaker, and he would actually demonstrate the various techniques of reproduction and so on and so forth. And again, as I said before, it brought people in that you wouldn't normally expect getting together. So as we got into where the strength of the collection was, obviously we could do more. Students and I could do more.
Mm-hmm. What goals did the 1998 Virginia Garrett lectures set? So that was the first lecture series, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
What goals did you have? For
Well,
that
I mean,
lecture series?
when we talked about, Gerald and I sort of came together on that, and he said, we need to do this. We need to announce, in effect, we're here. And we sort of took a key or a note from the Nebenzahl lectures at the Newberry in Chicago, and I had done a lot of work at the Newberry and had my own awakenings at the Newberry and so on and so forth. And we were talking about topics, and I said, I've been really interested in these Spanish soldier engineers, the first of whom came up with Oñate into New Mexico in 1612. Actually, we now know 1610. We've moved it back a little. And Gerald talked about it a little. And he said, the soldier engineers play a role in the 19th century, in the 1800s and so on and so forth. And we have a lot of their stuff. And we have a whole engineers collection. In fact, the essay Gerald did was on that collection, And so we sat down and we decided that soldier engineers was the topic, and the whole theory was we would this would be the first of an ongoing series of every 2 years, and we would try to publish them as we could, and so on. And that has its limitations because somebody has to oversee it. I oversaw some, Gerald oversaw some, but, we had other commitments and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But at least, the lecture series goes on.
So talk a little bit about the collaborations that came about from the lecture series over time, and how did that affect UTA? Did it boost UTA's profile, and if so, how?
Well, I mean, the map collection, I would argue, has put UTA on the map like nothing else in this campus has. We talk about your engineers, your scientists, all of these people. They're just more engineers, more scientists. I mean, good guys, good women, really doing important work. But I get a Rutgers newsletter, every week, and they're doing also good work and so on. But what we're known for around the world is this map collection.
And what about collaborations that came from that lecture series over time?
Well, we began to be able to, reach out to people. If you look at who over time gave lectures, everybody in the world who was anything in the field, my good friend David Woodward, who again I considered a mentor, but more importantly a good friend, and that on occasion we would bounce ideas off each other. He and Brian Harley came here and looked at our stuff while they were talking about the history of cartography series that sits right over there. And we bounced ideas of that off each other. In fact, when they came to doing the world beyond Europe, or rather primitive maps or they said, well, we're going to have this volume. I said, no, you're not going to have this volume. I said, you're going to have 3 or 4 volumes, And they said, oh, no. And I said, oh, and eventually we have 3, and so, and eventually not only did we get the people of reputation to do the lectures, but we got them to come here and see what we have and do work. You can't name someone in the field who hasn't been here and done some work.
Talk a little bit about the Garrett Endowment. It seems to be something that's pretty close to you.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Garretts not only donated the collections, but they put up money as they could on an annual basis into this endowment, which was to be used for purchases primarily, and then also to finance the lecture series. And the purchasing part of it works when you've got knowledgeable people to guide the purchasing process. But again, we were so well known, we had dealers coming to us saying, hey, you could use this or you could use that and so on. And some of them were really very good to us. I mean, we have this copper plate, Nimrod's familiar with it, the South America plate. The dealer who came to us with that, and knowing full well that it was right where and I had been screaming about a copper plate to show a period copper plate, and very costly for us, but he gave it to us for 4-year payments. So we got the plate and paid it off in 4 years.
Wow.
And this is the kind of cooperation we often got. And so once you've got dealers knowing what you're looking for, that helps the purchasing process. With regard to the Garrett lectures, the endowment has been, I would say, absolutely invaluable to the lectures over time. Now, what we haven't done is spent enough time refilling the coffers. And somewhere down the line, I would hope in the future, not mine, but this collection's future, that there'll be some sort of campaign or some sort of process by which that will take place.
Let's move into Dianne Garrett Powell. Mm-hmm. What do you recall about the Dianne Powell maps donation, and how did that add to the collection?
Well, let me say, first of all, you have to understand where Dianne's coming from, and that is where she came from. She was inheritor, along with her sister and her brother, to all of this collecting fever, if you will, that the Garretts had. Now, rarely do children follow in those footsteps. I mean, it's just not passed on. And at the same time, though, when they started going public with their collections and donating them and that, the kids understood, and Dianne, perhaps most of all, understood how important that was and how important the family seeing it to be. And so she inherited that part of it very much so. She also had I remember several conversations between J.C. Martin and me and her in San Antonio as we're riding on the barge in the canals, eating dinner and so on, about Texas cartography. So she began to really learn a lot of what her mother probably couldn't teach her, which parents often can't, And so she inherited in that respect too. And so she made no bones about it. The maps she got, she liked. If she didn't like them, she didn't get them. Which is, makes sense, right? And those, again, tend to fit very much. And that's important because what we have here then is the next generation sort of playing a role in guiding this. I would like to see a new generation, and that is perhaps grandchildren. There are a couple whom I'm aware of and whom we've talked, but I'm not getting involved because I don't want to put any pressure on anybody. By the way, to Dianne also, you can't deal with her unless you mention her husband, Boone.
Okay.
And Boone has been incredibly supportive and was supportive of her parents. And he was important to the whole process.
What, as adults, what were the children doing? What were their occupations?
Well, Dianne was in marketing, but not sales or marketing. But in other words, she would make things happen for people, and she had a fairly decent clientele and business down in the San Antonio area. Donna essentially, lives still in Marin County in California. And Jenkins Jr. had a publishing business for a while in Fort Worth. He's also a fairly decent chef, so he's been a cook in Fort Worth and so on and so forth. But none of it was, directly cartographically oriented. In fact, one point, Dianne quipped as a joke to Gerald, they're giving my inheritance away. And again, if you knew Virginia, that was also classic Virginia. She would have said something like that to her parents, on not meaning anything by it, just having fun with it,
What prompted you to donate maps to UTA, to Special Collections?
All right, two things, and I mentioned one of them, that is that the Garrett desire was that the seeds would then lead to, more growth. That was number one. Number two, working here in this wonderful facility, teaching here and so on, it's just sort of becomes part of you and you become part of it. And be honest with you, there was nothing I couldn't ask here. I had a rare book and I needed a book box built. And I said, I'll pay somebody here who knows how to do it. And they did. And the word came down, give it to him. And my maps, as I got new maps in our own collection, and I needed them to be encased and so on, it was here to do that. I mean, I didn't take advantage of it that much, but, and that, so, and then lastly, I mean, Judy and I literally made a promise to Virginia that what we had would come here unless they reject it. And she said, they better not.
What was your donation in 2023?
We have, part of our collection was just what we liked. Part of it was my own inclinations of being a Russian East European historian, Russian maps, but more importantly, Balkan maps, and particularly 18th and 19th century Balkan maps where the nations begin to form and so on. And so we donated approximately 2/3 of our collection then, and most of that was that stuff. What we kept, and some of that has since been given here. For example, I had a very good Eusebio Kino map, which I wanted just because I loved it to keep. But, eventually brought it here. I've in my briefcase, I've got some more stuff for him. I got another copper plate for you, by the way.
Just in your briefcase here, just walking around.
Yeah. And
you don't have a copper plate in your briefcase?
Who knew?
I mean, he's probably got a tape or something in his,
SD card.
SD. Oh, excuse me. Forgive my age,
Fair enough.
And literally, promised them we would do it. But again, my dream is theirs, that it would grow, that ours would help and so on. What we kept were Herman Mall maps, and I've got, I think 57 of them now that I'm still hanging on to, and one or two others, primarily just because I like them and I don't want to see them go yet. But I'm hoping to talk to people here about the rest of it coming soon here. And the reason I kept the Mall maps, not only because, I'm still fascinated by him, but I still hope to either revise the book I wrote on him or write a whole new book on him. And I was in London last week for a couple of days, doing some work on looking at which way to go, either revise or do a new one.
As a professor emeritus, your toe is still in the happenings of UTA. What parts of the cartographic holdings do you think are underused? And how would you suggest they be unlocked?
Well, to be honest with you, I honestly think that the more modern stuff is underused. I don't know that, but it seems to me that it is. And the reason is because those areas on campus that could gain a lot from that aren't aware or don't care. Now, the creation of this history and geography department, I think will go some distance in helping that. Because the geographers are the people, particularly the ones we have, are the people that know this modern stuff, as I call it. So that I think is underused. I think that the stuff that combines with the major areas that the history department is dealing with, Texas and the West, Europe, in say from the 17th century to the 20th. That gets its use.
Mm-hmm.
And don't forget about the benefits of digitization.
Yeah,
This makes it much more accessible
exactly.
than 15 years ago.
Right, exactly. It does. I mean, I helped to write the first grants, for digitization of this, where we combined with North Texas, and so on. And that's incredibly. I mean, I still, if I was seriously working on something, would come here to touch and see the map. But for someone who needs it for an article or a book or just as a reference, digitization is marvelous.
I was about to ask you about that, about digitization versus having the map in hand, whether it be literally or figuratively, having the map in hand. What do you think the difference is?
Well, I mean, we historians are children of the archaeologists. And the archaeologist wouldn't dare take a picture of something and deal with it when he can hold the skull, the pot, the jewel, whatever. And that's the way I feel. In other words, if we're talking about the map as an artifact, however you want to use it as an artifact, whether it's production, whether it's subject matter, whether it's artwork, whether it's design, all of that reaches a limit when it's digitized. You need to go back to the original. And you need to, as Brian Harley said to me, you got to look at the bugger from back, from front, from side. He said, if you can get away with it, wrinkle it a little, and so on and so forth, because it tells you so much. But, you're getting there into a field where specialists are involved. That is, where people like me and Imre are involved. For many people, the digitization is just perfect. But I'm a tactile person. I when I hold my mall maps, I think of him printing them. I think of the engraving process. And if you look at a couple of the latest things I've written on him, it all has to do with sort of how he came to this incredible aesthetic that he has,
And you see it also what it does with a student when they can come up here and see the real thing, which they already have known from digital images I use in the teaching. But if you have then the tactile sensation, if you come close, if you smell it, if you can bend it a little bit.
Yeah, we have some of the, again, that we talked about in our Soldier Engineers book, some of the maps from post-Mexican War period by some of the great American military engineers. And Norman Thrower, who for years headed up a major collection at UCLA, was here, and he worked here for 2 weeks. He stayed with me and worked here for 2 weeks. And he was amazed at all the notations on our maps by these engineers whom he had only seen maps of without their annotations on them. Yeah. And we, again, to the Garrett's credit, they recognized that was not a desecration of a map, but that was an addition to it. That was important.
So what should UTA add to the collection?
Major funding. No, I'm serious. UTA needs to, if they're serious and if they really understand what they have here, and I don't think they do, but they have to show their support for it by, for example, helping the Garrett Endowment. Put a pot of money available, budget item, and I'm not saying how much, and then leave it to the people here in special collections, Imre in the chair, and so on and so forth, to decide what's needed, what's helpful, what's a good deal, what's unique. I mean, when we celebrated its, what was it? I think it was 20th anniversary. We wanted to buy an item that would sort of be unique. And we went to William Graham, a Rader, the major map dealer at that point in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. And he had a portal-in chart of the New World, of North America. And it was 1567 or something like that. It was gorgeous. And a raider was known for his outrageous prices. So the word was you take his price, cut it in half, and then you dicker with him. And we eventually got it to I think it was $87,000. At the time, right? And it was a deal. And he knew he was going to, but we told him, oh, you'll be loved because of all of this and that. And then we said, can we pay it off, $10,000 a year? And he said, no. And so we went to the university and got nothing. And there was an opportunity for them, for example, to pay for the map and then let us pay them back over 10 years. What a raider wouldn't do for whatever business reasons he was into. But the university, and it would have been sitting here. It would have been on a wall somewhere here forever. And the kids, the students, the staff from all over would be coming and looking at this thing. Because one of the things we don't have is a Portland chart. And when we used to teach Portland charts, and when Immer teaches Portland charts, we have to go to images and not the real thing.
Is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't talked about?
No, I think my feelings have come through in the respect that I wish the university community, but more importantly, the university itself would recognize what it has here in special collections. Not only the maps, we've got the Texas Labor Archives, we've got this political collection, again, Texas-centered, fine, that's great. But I don't think they realize, what special collections are all about. The other thing you asked me what else we need a new library. We need a huge new library where at least 2 to 3 floors are special collections. Like in Austin. They have a whole special collections library, Castaneda, and we periodically had been on that. I always said to Virginia, if I win the lottery, the big one, I said, I'll come here and I'll say, build me a library. I said, and what we want is the Garrett Reinhartz library. I used to say that. I said, if we had the money. But you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, But they managed to throw up buildings all over the place here. And as we have said before, the library is the heart of the university. For everybody.
Well, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed.
Oh,
I really
I
appreciate
enjoyed
it. Very informative.
I got to vent.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much.